Thank you for organizing this very important conference for Robbie. And it has been mentioned, I would like to speak about the neoliberalization and the Kádár regime. This is a ongoing project which have been elaborated at the LTET, of course, the Institute of Political History. So this lecture is based on the approach that neoliberalism is an economic, political, and cultural sets of ideas embedded into the West and East and linked to the center and the semi-periphery of global capitalism. It aims the fundamental transformation of social arrangements. Neoliberalism is based on the fundamentalism of the self-regulating market. This has provoked considerable social resistance throughout the history of global capitalism. As Károly Polanyi argues in his very famous and influential book, The Great Transformation, social self-defense and its counterwave rise against the market processes and the mentioned market fundamentalism. In my view, one of the main explanation for the success of the neoliberal approach in the Kádár regime is that when the state socialism began to make conscious and organized use of experts' knowledge, it already has a very strong neoliberal charge. And more importantly, the Hungarian Socialist Workers' Party, MSZP, can no longer provide an adequate ideological alternative or ideological hegemony to influx of neoliberal approach. That's why I would like to speak about just very briefly the roots of neoliberalism and its antecedents in the Habsburg Empire. After that, I will summarize the early embedded neoliberalization process in terms of Hungary. And after that, I would like to put an emphasis on the tendencies and movements of neoliberalization during the Kádár regime. First of all, the new economic mechanism. After that, the financial integration, and my last point will be the well-known debt crisis of the regime. So this would be my my lecture. So the various economic and political steps, the mentioned new economic mechanism, the financial integration to IMF and World Bank, and of course the debt crisis will be investigated here as the procedure of neoliberalization. Moreover, I put an emphasis on the neoliberalization of Kádár regime has taken place as an ideological and intellectual project which was dominated by the reform economists of the regime as an organic intellectuals in a Gramscian sense. It was in the context of the political and economic opening of the Kádár regime to the West, in which the neoliberalization process began. This ended the state socialist welfare state before the regime change and laid the foundation of the policy of a continuous austerity politics during and after the Hungarian and Eastern European regime changes. So my first point is about, just very briefly, because it's in some manner is out of our scope, but I feel very important to put an emphasis on the early roots of neoliberalization, because it contains some very important Hungarian elements. First of all, the early theoretical origins of the antecedents of the embedded neoliberalism is the framework of Austro-Hungarian Empire. The Habsburg Empire was one of the main cradles of neoliberalism, as Queen Slobodian argues very well. There is a quote: "It traces neoliberal globalism as an intellectual project that began in the ashes of the Habsburg Empire. Quote ends. The main players in this field were, first of all, Ludwig von Mises, Friedrich Hayek, moreover, who belonged to the Vienna Circle and maintained the neoliberal ideas. It is to say that the views of neoliberalism on globalization also rooted in the Central European perspective, because after all, because after the fall of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, it was Central Europe, European neoliberals who most consistently looked at the world as a whole or a globalized structure. The internationalism of neoliberalism, elaborated by Friedrich Hayek, is very rooted in the multi-ethnic and multilingual framework of Austro-Hungarian Empire, which has become such a lost object of identification for many people around Viennaized intellectuals. This had a significant impact on the Hungarian neoliberal tradition, as Joanna Bachmann and Jill Eyal argues very, very sharply. There was an exchange of ideas on neoliberalism. There is a quote, the roots of this rapid and strong embrace of neoliberalism reside in the transnational network composed of both American and East European economists, quote ends. I would like to give you just very, very briefly the methodological, theoretical perspective of this project. The early and embedded neoliberalization of Hungary. Central and Eastern Europe societies were shocked by the regime changes of the late 1980s. History didn't end, but in some respects, the existing world order did. The economic and world political failure of the alternative system to global capitalism, existing state socialism, which had been considered viable at least until then. This, in turn, made the economic, political, and social integration of the former Soviet sphere of interest in the Central and Eastern European countries of the West irreversible. Above all, the changes in public law resulted in the construction of Eastern clones of the post-war constitutional democracies of Western Europe. New constitution replaced the Soviet constitutional structure with a constitutional system of liberal democracy. However, the process of public and political westernization is embedded in the process of economic regime changes and the reintegration of the Central and Eastern European countries into global capitalism, which had begun much more earlier. It has been claimed here that the rapid and shocking dissolution of the countries of Central and Eastern Europe, including Hungary, into global capitalism occurred precisely because it was prepared by the gradual and multi-level neoliberal approach. In addition, besides the external geo and world political situation and causes, the neoliberalization was successful because the state socialist experiment found itself in opposition to the Eastern antecedents of neoliberalism, which were increasingly embedded in the changing Kádár regime itself. In this way, it is fair to say that Fukuyama was wrong about the end of history, and the liberal democracy didn't become a universal political system, but that regime change could only have taken place because neoliberal capitalism penetrated state socialism and reform communists and reform economists, who had been involved in dismantling this system from within since the 1970s and 1980s, had a fundamental influence on the character of neoliberalism. Bachmann and Eyal make very sharp point in this sense, the fact that neoliberalism was not primarily conceived as a Western colonial ideology, but as a paradigm that internally and latently eroded state socialism, played a huge role in the Western integration of the state socialist countries of Central and Eastern Europe, especially Hungary. This explains, among other things, that almost unbridged enthusiasm for the reforms shown by the puppeteering elite in these countries, which was almost completely obvious that the burdens imposed on societies by the regime changes and the establishment of market economies. According to Bachmann and Eyal, there is a quote, "How false it is to assume that shocking therapy was imposed on the post-communist countries by Western economists and the IMF By the mid-1980s, virtually all the future transformers had already reached the conclusion that socialist economy was bankrupt. They depicted it as nothing but a system of destroyed capitalism suffering from extreme macroeconomic imbalance on the verge of macroeconomic disaster. There was no time to lose, but neither could one play any longer with the sort of reforms which were only the imitation of capitalism under increasingly relaxed constraints. Quote ends. In studying the Hungarian regime change and the preceding reform period, we often come across the experience that some of the reform communists of the Kádár regime and the emerging democratic opposition wanted to become more capitalist than the capitalists. And therefore it became a commonplace how much the regime change would shock the society. Bachmann and Antal sharply point out that the state socialist countries function as a kind of neoliberal laboratory. There is a quote, "The roots of this rapid and strong embrace of neoliberalism reside in the transnational network composed of both American and Eastern European economists." Quote ends. My third point is about the concrete procedure of neoliberalization, the Kádár regime, and the mentioned points and mentioned structure of the neoliberalization. I use neoliberalization in double sense. On the one hand, the effects of the double dependency, specifically the dependence of the Kádár regime on the global capitalist center, are beginning to the amplified of the regime itself. On the other hand, neoliberalism as a hegemonic ideology was infiltrating in parallel to the regime. But much more than this has happened. Neoliberalism as an ideology of global capitalism has begun to develop its East Central European components. I put an emphasis on three main factors of neoliberalization: the mentioned new economic mechanism, the financial integration, and debt crisis. New economic mechanism. For the emerging Kádár regime, material and ideological legitimacy was a crucial factor after 1956. Because of the rise of 1956 and of course as a consequence of it. In the context of the state socialist regime, the welfare system that unfolded within the anti-capitalist structure meant paramount importance. The new economic mechanism called NEM of 1968 will be significant precisely because it was the Kádár regime attempt to preserve economic sustainability and with it, the welfare state policies that ensured the system after emerging from the 1956 crisis. And at the same time, it will be the first opening to the center of global capitalism through which not only market relations are incorporated into domestic economic governance, but also to provide a bridgehead for a neoliberal approach. The new economic mechanism represents such a pressure from outside throughout indebtedness and integration into international financial institutions, and from within throughout reformist economists turning towards neoliberalism. That the Kádár regime will no longer be able to sustain itself in the 1980s. In other words, the neoliberal zeitgeist of the last decade of the Kádár regime was established in economic and ideological terms precisely in 1986. From that point of view of neoliberalism and state socialism as a mentioned laboratory, in 1986 is also important because it can be seen as an economic experiment in state-led socialism, which integrated market elements into state socialism. From the beginning, the new economic mechanism was surrounded by the spirit or some kind of spirit of capitalism. János Kádár himself at the third national meeting of the Socialist Brigade leaders in April of 1969 addressed the fears that the focus of profit motivates a return to capitalism. Kádár confidently refuted these claims. There is a quote, "This is of course not true. our reform is a socialist reform of a socialist economy, quote ends. Of the many contradiction, of the Kádár regime as it embarked on the path of neoliberalization. Perhaps one of the most interesting is that the 1989 new economic mechanism were significant both for those who celebrated the marketization of the state socialist regime and for those who called attention to the state socialist counterweights to gradual neoliberalization. My second point goes to the financial integration to IMF and World Bank. From the mid-1960s, during the period of preparation of the new economic mechanism, the idea of credit for the Hungarian economy, which was in serious difficulties, was again raised. After a long process, which lasted almost 20 years, the institutional integration of the People's Republic of Hungary to IMF and World Bank has been implemented. On the recommendation of the IMF Executive Board, the Board of Governors voted in favor of Hungary's admission, and János Fekete signed the instrument of accession in 1982, making the People's Republic of Hungary to the member of the IMF. A team of expertise was already sent to Budapest to prepare the possible borrowing procedure in 1989 and consulted on the conditions and options. But the main issue was to access the domestic version and vision of how to achieve a balanced position in economic sense. In the meantime, in 1989, Hungary also joined the World Bank. And some words about the history or some parts of the history of the debt crisis. If you looking at the concentrated figures of the indebtedness under the Kádár regime, we see that Hungary's gross public debt in 1973 was $2.1 billion, which reached $20.4 billion by the regime change period. As a share of GDP, net public debt increased from 9.2% to 66.5% of the GDP. Two debt waves took place in the Kádár regime, the first between 1973 and 1979, and then from 1979 onwards, Kádár regime was forced to adjust, and this gave some regime to the regime some time. The second debt wave only started in 1982 and 1985. But this time, gain was only able to delay the inevitable neoliberal turn. It is therefore clear that the Kádár regime was already struggling with the problematic of indebtedness before financial integration, which was exacerbated by neoliberalization, and that the second wave also qualitatively changed the situation of state socialism, since joining the IMF and the World Bank went hand in hand with the gradual hegemony of the neoliberal approach. On the subject of the indebtedness, it is a rather simplistic explanation that the rapid increase in debt was due to the fact that the Kádár regime overconsumed in order to preserve its legitimacy. And that this, together with the interest of this overconsumption, put a strain on the public finances. Among the real causes of indebtedness, an important factor was the fact that the Hungarian National Bank chose the most unfavorable currency for the debt issue in terms of the revaluations. The primary cause of indebtedness was far from overconsumption. Direct overconsumption was negligible, less than $1 billion. Even with the interest of the overconsumption, it couldn't have contributed more than $4 billion to the increase in debt. Making some conclusions. Neoliberalism has a very complex and multi-wave impact on Hungary. One of the most important guiding threads of the impact of neoliberalism is the role of the state. Contrary to the popular opinion, neoliberalism is not an all anti-state in the sense that it is very much in need of the state. It needs the state to ensure that the market is paramount and that the state doesn't undermine the efficiency of the market and the position of capital interest above all else through welfare transfers. Queen Slobodian makes it very sharply that neoliberalism in Europe happens to be created within a state and legal framework in order to create a minimalist state that is very much active in the interest of the market. In Europe, there is a quote, neoliberalism emerged in the 1930s less as an economic project than as a project of politics and law. The search was on for models of governance at scale from the local to the global and would best in case protect the space of the world economy, quote ends. It is precisely the state dependency of the neoliberalism that will be brought back again and again neoliberalism to East Central Europe, where the economic and social role of the state is historically decisive. The most important feature of the neoliberal tradition, which was built up under the Kádár regime and transformed the state socialist establishment, is that the neoliberalism of the reformist economist is far from being anti-state, but very much expects the state itself to maintain the framework of capitalism. The East-West discourse and the transfer of ideas were important for Western neoliberal circles, precisely because they wanted to transpose the experience of the state socialism with its plan setting and a kind of mixed economy that had been developing since 1989 to the countries at the center of capitalism. Thank you for your attention.